analyze the impact of globalization on Dixon Ticonderoga. Now, not only that, we will also analyze the responses it has made to the changes in the organization's environment and the effectiveness of their methods of protecting their business and expanding outside of their home country. Additionally, we'll compare and contrast Dixon with Ford. In order to analyze the changes, firstly we will illustrate Dixon's background and the context of its century. On more general terms, it must be noted that there are 4 phases of globalization, and we are currently in the 4th one, which began in 1980. This phase is characterized by changes in technology and political attitudes and in the economic policies as well. The result is that consumers are less concerned with the national identity of products, are more open to products from outside of their country. The Dixon Ticonderoga Company is one of America's oldest corporations and roots back to the 1700s in New England. It has evolved for over 200 years and traces its heritage to the proponents of the American Revolution, actually. And it was initially owned by Joseph Dixon, but then merged with Bryan Mora Corporation in 1982. And it used to always pride itself on its American origin and its quality. In 1990, it moved the headquarters to Heathrow, Orlando, Florida. And the 90s represented a period of crisis for Dixon, particularly because of China's emerging market competing with cheaper pencils. What this brought them to do is to move to Mexico to start manufacturing them, and this began an international supply chain. And today, it is a subsidiary of Fila, which is an Italian company, and it is based in Milan. As you can see, there are 600 people in 4 different locations, also in France, Spain, and Chile. And as you can see on the board, that the data has changed. Like, there are only 30,000 workers, of which 300 in the US. And to better understand these decisions, Joanne is now going to talk about the Chinese emerging market.
In 1990s, Chinese manufacturers entered the market with low-price pencils. Not only Dixon, but also the US pencil industry is seriously hit because China sells at dumping price. China is price competitive because it's self-sufficient of raw material. Unlike US, which relies on import of raw material, China has its own domestic wood. This lowers Chinese production costs. Secondly, there are some trade policies supported by Chinese government. The first one is value-added tax rebate. Usually, all goods sold within China are subject to 17% of tax. However, if it's sold overseas, Chinese producers can receive 13% tax rebate. This actually becomes export subsidy. Secondly, Chinese currency is manipulated by Chinese government so that they are fixed and highly undervalued. The Chinese pencils have an advantage over price. As a result, there are some growing imbalance between US and China. In 1994, the US government imposed anti-dumping duties, but it still failed because some Chinese producers went through an administrative process with the US government and asked for a reduction rate. Also, some producers have unlawful practice. For example, the transshipment via a third country which is not subject to the duties. Also, some of them purposely mislabel the country of origin for the pencils. As a result, import from China rose again, and Dixon is still hit. In the following, Sophie will talk about how Dixon responded to China's threat.
So after Dixon accrued losses of $200 million between 1991 and 1999, Dixon needed to change to become successful and profitable facing the changing market. Unfortunately, trying domestically to lower the cost of production failed, so it responded in the following ways. Firstly, relying on trade barriers. As previously mentioned, Dixon went to the government in support of protectionist policies, placing heavy anti-dumping duties on the Chinese pencils. They should have realised sooner that they were too dependent on the government, as they became complacent, believing this was the only course of action required. Eventually, they realised they needed to become more proactive and modify the product. They needed to cut costs, so they did this by changing their raw materials. Firstly, they imported a cheaper substitute for the wooden casing the pencil. It's currently made out of Indonesian gelatin wood, in all but its premium pencil. Secondly, they used outsourcing, importing a cheaper rubber for the pencil from a Korean supplier. This ultimately led to the beginnings of the international supply chain. Dixon utilised lower labour costs to reduce its production costs, responding through foreign direct investment, which is a manifestation of globalisation. Dixon invested in Mexico and established a manufacturing subsidiary there and in China in 2000. This began the shifting of production away from the US. Clearly, this had implications for the initial trade restrictions, and as a result of this global supply chain, Dixon was excluded from this initial trade agreement. Next, Dixon restructured its business plan. It reduced its range of products, targeting more of a niche market. Equally, Dixon responded to the industrial restructuring it was facing, realising that China had comparative advantage in manufacturing, and it moved its production here, closing its last manufacturing plant in the US where 200 people lost their jobs, but established its headquarters in Heathrow, Florida. Similarly to the UK, the United States is experiencing industrial restructuring, earning money through the tertiary sector and financial services. Finally, to refresh the global image of Dixon, in 2012, Dixon launched the Prang Power Recycling Programme, a nationwide recycling scheme inspired by the efforts of school children to recycle used plastic art markers. This is a method in which Dixon is using its multinational corporation to promote its products whilst caring for the environment, as can be seen by the quote on the board. Overall, it's fair to conclude that they responded too slowly. Concerns with saving US jobs rendered them myopic and ignorant of the cheaper labour costs elsewhere. They should have realised sooner that the industry was becoming more concentrated, especially with China producing at a lower cost and gaining a larger market share.
As Sophie just said, there were a lot of measures taken to become competitive and profitable again. However, not all of them were effective and beneficial for the company. Since Dixon acquired firms related to its core business, it brought the company to the operation in a very specific niche market. They branded Ticonderoga No. 2 pencil, various marketing strategies that was just mentioned, such as recycling program, and changing supply chain brought comparative advantage to Dixon. But the range of products has been reduced significantly, and that weakened company's positions. In comparison, its main competitor Sanford, that was #1 manufacturer in the US, had a wider range of goods and more branded names that allowed them to dominate in the market. Outsourcing changes were effective and allowed to cut the production cost and gave an opportunity to the company to maintain competitive in the market as well as to expand abroad. On the other side, the restructuring actions led to the closure of most of factories in the US, Canada and Mexico. All these changes reflected by a drop in share prices. Moreover, it arose constraints, so despite on the reduction in management, there were many difficulties in operation between Mexico, Japan, China, Indonesia and USA. By 2004, Dixon Ticonderoga struggled with its debts and constant net losses, so the company wasn't able to cope with it independently and was acquired by Italian company Filafabbrica for $60 million, including assumption of its debt. So that allowed the company to maintain operation and existence. Nevertheless, it's no longer an American company and it cannot act independently. As a conclusion, it should be said that all these measures would be much more effective if taken earlier. As Gino Palla, the former CEO, said, he waited for too long to close some inefficient factories, discontinue slow-moving projects and group the administrative staff in one location.
Finally, I want to make a comparison to a company in a completely different sector that has also been affected by globalisation. I decided to look at the Ford Motor Company, as similarly it's an American institution with a long and rich history that has struggled to make a profit in recent times due to increased global competition. In the late 1990s, Ford's automotive division stopped being profitable and the company was kept out of the red by its financial arm. By 2003, this was no longer the case, and the company sustained losses from then until 2008, when it lost $14.6 billion, its biggest annual loss ever. In late 2005, Ford's American division president, Mark Fields, was asked by the board to develop a plan called The Way Forward. In this document, he used similar tactics to Dixon to cut costs, including cutting 30,000 jobs and closing 14 factories. He also suggested dropping some inefficient and unprofitable models, which is reminiscent of Dixon having to change the wood used in their pencils. Another tactic, again used by both companies, was to outsource production to cheaper suppliers in emerging economies. As previously mentioned, Dixon started importing their rubbers from Korea, whereas Ford started to follow the example of Japanese manufacturers and increased the number of parts in its cars it outsourced. Since 2000, there has been a close correlation between outsourcing and profits in the automotive industry, with Honda leading the field, outsourcing up to 80% of some models. The American Big Three of Chrysler, GM and Ford have all made huge losses this millennia and outsourced as little as 50% of some models. Perhaps the biggest temporary weapon Ford had to stem its losses